this video and over the next 3 weeks, we will be discussing a completely new topic. So we will be talking about challenges to the internal security of India. So before we get into what these challenges are, I think it is important to specify what exactly internal security is. So internal security essentially consists of the methods or the tactics or the policies that are used to guarantee peace and stability or law and order within the borders of a sovereign country. So we know that every sovereign state, they face challenges both from inside the country and from outside the country, challenges to its security. So though there may sometimes be a nexus, and there generally is a nexus between internal security threats and external security threats, doctrinally we view them separately. So when we talk about internal security and challenges to internal security, we have to essentially look at two different kinds of challenges. So on the one hand, we have conventional or traditional threats to internal security, whereas on the other hand, we have non-traditional or non-conventional threats to internal security. So traditional threats to internal security essentially are those challenges that have existed for years in history and that most people generally know about, and that there exists a degree of academic research about. So a good example would be insurgencies or guerrilla movements or armed warfare, because and significant amount of research exists on these topics, and of course these have existed for years in history in various different forms. On the other hand, non-conventional or non-traditional threats to internal security essentially talks about threats that have emerged due to changing global circumstances or transformations in the global order. So examples of this, for example, would be climate change or cybersecurity threats. Now, terrorism, on the other hand, has a unique distinction of belonging to both of these categories. Now, of course, on one hand, it is a conventional security, internal security threat, because it has existed for decades and decades in history, ever since India became independent. And there does exist a significant amount of academic research about it. People generally know what it is. There are even departments in universities that focus on terrorism or essentially counterterrorism. On the other hand, however, terrorism also has a changing face. This face of terrorism has also changed, and it has evolved and it has emerged. Terrorism of the kind that it is today, it has also changed due to revolutions in communications and technology that have made terrorism an even more frightening reality. In fact, truthfully speaking, one of the biggest reasons why terrorism has emerged and it looks the way it does today, due to its massive access to so much high-tech or even low-tech weaponry, is because of the fact that after the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the aftermath or the consequences of the arms race or the armed build-up, the entire black market, especially in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, these areas essentially, or even West Asia, they were flooded with cheap, accessible and easy to conceal high-tech weapons. So essentially these fell into the hands of the armed militants or in the hands of the terrorists, and this is why terrorism has emerged and it has changed the way it looks today. Now essentially there is no legal or comprehensively accepted definition of terrorism that is generally conceded to by all member nations. So there is no legal definition of it. However, existing sectoral treaties or declarations or resolutions have come up with a basic definition that is agreeable to most of the parties that are concerned or most important stakeholders. So the United Nations Security Council or the United Nations General Assembly have defined terrorism mostly as criminal acts that are intended to cause panic amongst a general population. These acts are intended, these are criminal acts that are intended to cause either death or grievous bodily injury or taking of hostages, and its purpose essentially is to intimidate the population or to compel a government to either do or refrain from doing something. So now essentially in all these treaties and even in these resolutions that have been released by the United Nations Security Council or the United Nations General Assembly, these words somewhat differ. But what all of these existing declarations or documents essentially agree upon is the fact that terrorist acts are in all ways unjustifiable. So these declarations also say that these acts are unjustifiable regardless of whatever political, racial, ethnic, philosophical, ideological, historical, cultural, whatever reasons are given to substantiate it, these acts are unjustifiable. So essentially this is at the crux of what terrorism is. So then, of course, when we talk about terrorism, specifically terrorism in India, it is important to also talk about the different actors that exist in it. So, of course, on the one hand, we have actors that are external or state actors, and whereas on the other hand, we have non-state actors. So, external or foreign state actors are essentially when terrorism is employed as a means by another state to intimidate either its own population or the population of another neighboring state, generally speaking. So the example of the Bleed India with 1,000 Cuts doctrine that is still followed by Pakistan and the ISI, where they have covertly financed, monetarily, structurally, infrastructurally, even in terms of training, where they have essentially supported groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba or the Indian Mujahideen, is one example of this. Now, on the other hand, we also have non-state actors. Now, non-state actors are in no way directly or indirectly connected to any government. So, they are essentially engaging in terror to fulfill their own aims. Now, of course, the degree to which an independent non-state actor can exist without the support of any government is questionable, and the Lashkar-e-Taiba is an example of this because it doesn't formally essentially recognize any government as supporting it. But of course, scholars have said that it is impossible that it would have been able to mobilize the kind of finances and armed support that it has without the support of at least one other state. So in general, that state is thought to be Pakistan. So when we talk about terrorism in India, it has gone through several phases and it has involved a multiplicity of state and non-state actors. And but in general, when we talk about internal security challenges to India, we talk about terrorism, and of course, therefore the name Kashmir comes into mind. It is very important to look at the role of Pakistan and the ISI, because these bodies, the Pakistan and its intelligence agency, the ISI, they have essentially conducted for years several covert operations to essentially infiltrate and destabilize India. So at the core of this is the Bleed India with 1,000 Cuts doctrine. Now, this doctrine is thought to still influence Pakistan's military and political or policy circles, according to our Army Chief Bipin Rawat. So, essentially, this doctrine is first credited to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's speech in the General Assembly in 1965. So, this is just before the Indo-Bangladesh War or Indo-Pakistan War, essentially, which led to the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. So essentially, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto vowed to use this war to sever the whole of eastern India and to make it essentially permanently join East Pakistan and also form a separate Khalistan state from Punjab. Now, essentially, of course, Pakistan lost this war and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was deposed by his army chief Zia-ul-Haq, who then replaced him as president. However, this doctrine continued and in fact it even strengthened, because Zia-ul-Haq, alongside his close confidant or close personal friend Hamid Gul, Lieutenant General Hamid Gul, who served as a director to the ISI or chief of the ISI for some years, these two individuals, they strengthened and bolstered the doctrine. And essentially their goal was to utilize low intensity covert warfare through militancy and infiltration to destabilize the peace within the country. And in fact, when we talk about terrorism not only in India but also in the region, various scholars have essentially pointed to Lieutenant General Hamid Gul as the godfather of modern terrorism for the important role that he played in either directly funding and directly supporting or indirectly influencing a lot of terrorist outfits and a lot of militant outfits all throughout the region. So Hamid Gul's role in, for example, financing and inspiring outfits like the Lashkar-e-Taiba or the Jaish-e-Muhammad or the Indian Mujahideen, or even having connections to the Al-Qaeda, have been well noted by scholars and analysts all around the world. And of course, Pakistan has concertedly denied the fact that they have ever indulged themselves in destabilizing India's security. But statements by Hamid Gul himself also prove otherwise. In 2014, in an interview to the Pakistani media, he clarified that if there are any militant outfits operating in Kashmir, they are only doing the job of Pakistan's military. And this ideology or this approach has also been perfectly evident by the way that Pakistan and the ISI have also approached other struggles that that India has been encountering. So when there was at the peak of the Khalistan movement, which was a secessionist movement to essentially form a separate state Khalistan from existing Punjab, what the ISI did is that they built a secret Punjab cell within its headquarters to train and radicalize young Sikhs. And in fact, this has been the best proven by Hamid Gul famously remarking to Benazir Bhutto that there should be no problem in Pakistan helping these Khalistani militants, or essentially it was in Pakistan's best interest for Punjab to be destabilized, because as he said, having an unstable Punjab is like having an extra contingent of the Pakistan's army in India at no extra cost to the taxpayer. So this is on one side of the story. Hamid Gul also was responsible for training and arming the Mujahideens in Afghanistan at that time, under the West-led Axis, to essentially fight the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So after the Mujahideen had succeeded in successfully uprooting the Soviet forces from Afghanistan, Hamid Gul and Ziaul Haq both conspired to essentially utilize these militants in their asymmetrical warfare against India. So these Mujahideens, or these militants, essentially they form the basis of all the terrorist outfits that are active in India today. In fact, what the ISI also did, though it of course denies it, there are reports proving that it has, what the ISI also did is that it also made training camps on the other side of the LOC in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and it brought disenchanted youth from Indian Kashmir. It brought them over to the LOC, it trained them, it radicalized them, and it sent them back to Srinagar. So essentially at the core of the development of terrorism in India and Pakistan's role therein in that, and it continues to play this role because ISI agents have also been arrested presently in Bangladesh and Myanmar for being involved in a fake Indian currency racket. And the basic perspective behind this is twofold. So the first thing here is that after the defeat of Pakistan in the 1971 war, Pakistan essentially realized that it would be difficult to win a conventional war against India, even though it is backed by its nuclear arsenal. So because Pakistan realized it is difficult to win a conventional war against India, what they thought to do was to essentially use asymmetrical warfare or low intensity or covert warfare to essentially win this. So bleed India with 1,000 cut essentially meant that if they destabilized parts of Kashmir or they destabilized parts of India by essentially fomenting insurgency or fomenting militancy or terrorism, essentially what that would do is that essentially it would make India necessarily send all or focus its armed forces within those states, which would lead to a lot of military expenditure and a lot of economic losses. So Pakistan's perspective was that if they are able to do this, they would be able to harass India's economic progress, and eventually when they would want to fight a conventional war with India, India would be economically unable to do so, and its military would be fatigued. Now, so because of this reason, these terrorist groups have been used not only as proxies but also as weapons in this asymmetrical warfare that Pakistan has continued to wage with India. Now, essentially, of course, the truth of the matter is that jihadist militia has not won Pakistan. Its support, this doctrine and its support for the jihadist militia has not won Pakistan any supporters in the international arena, because the whole of the international community absolutely abhors jihad. On the other hand, of course, India and its effort to successfully mitigate the situation surrounded by Pakistan so close on its borders, and in fact intruding into its borders and now coupling up with China, India's efforts have also been appreciated across the world. So when we talk of internal security threats to India, and when we talk about terrorism, we don't not only have the Lashkar-e-Taiba or the Indian Mujahideen or the ex-JKLF or Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, who were, for example, mostly responsible for the painful exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits from Kashmir. We also have the growing role of the ISIS. Now, the ISIS essentially are generally, they are mobilizing forces in India, and they are training and arming and radicalizing some parts or some individuals from especially the southern states in India. And there have been a lot of arrests that have taken place on suspected ISIS sympathizers. So ISIS is also an emerging threat to the internal security in India when we talk about terrorism. So if the Indian government has to better deal with these threats, the most important step that they need to take is the formation of, number one, a proper legal framework, because the only one that exists now is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which doesn't specifically deal with terrorism. That is after the TADA and the POTA were repealed. And it also needs a strong and efficient counter-agency intelligence sharing mechanism that would synergize the efforts of various intelligence gathering and counter-terrorism agencies, and that would also allow them to better liaise with law enforcement or local law enforcement agencies like the police and the state's own surveillance systems.